Hey, you're back. Welcome to Season 2 of The People We Meet. My name is Ty Brunner, and I'll be your host. This is a show about ordinary people that have done extraordinary things. I'm glad you're here, and let's get on with it. Hello, and welcome to another episode of The People We Meet. This is going to be another Voices of the Past. That's right. It's story time. So sit down, grab your little bag of Skittles, and let me tell you a story. On October 27, 1962, 3 Soviet officers aboard a submarine in the Caribbean Sea argued about whether to launch a nuclear weapon. The temperature inside the boat had climbed past 100 degrees, and the air was thick with carbon dioxide. The crew hadn't heard from Moscow in hours. And outside the hull, American warships were dropping explosives into the ocean. Captain Valentin Savitsky believed that the war had already begun, and he ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. Now, deep inside the cramped control room, the submarine rocked as another explosion rolled through the water. Now, the blasts were not meant to destroy the vessel. They were small practice depth charges intended to force the submarine to surface. But the men inside of B-59 didn't know that. All they knew was that American ships surrounded them, and explosions kept echoing through the hull. Savitsky reached a terrifying conclusion. The war had already started, he thought, and sitting in the torpedo tube beneath their feet was a weapon powerful enough to destroy an entire fleet, the nuclear torpedo. And if you've ever seen the movie Crimson Tide, you've seen Hollywood's version of this nightmare. A submarine crew arguing about whether to launch the nuclear weapons after communication with command breaks down. But what happened in October of 1962 was real, and the decision about whether that nuclear torpedo would be launched came down to a single guy, a Soviet naval officer named Vasily Arkhipov. Most people had never heard of him. But there's a pretty good chance you're alive today because of the decision that he made that day. And the reason I wanted to tell you this story right now is because we like to think moments like that belong in history, but they don't. To understand how a Soviet submarine ended up on the brink of launching a nuclear weapon in the middle of the Atlantic, we got to rewind the clock a few weeks. That's October 1962, and the Cold War has been simmering for more than a decade. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in a rivalry that is part ideological struggle, part technological arms race, and part mutual suspicion. Each side believes the other is trying to dominate the world. Each side is building nuclear weapons at a staggering pace. By the early 1960s, both nations possess enough nuclear firepower to destroy the planet many times over. The terrifying logic of the era is something military strategists have started calling mutually assured destruction. The idea that if one side launches a nuclear attack, the other will respond in kind, and civilization itself may not survive the exchange. And yet, despite that terrifying balance, the two superpowers keep pushing the limits. In 1962, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev makes a bold and extremely risky decision. He orders nuclear missiles to be secretly installed in Cuba. The island nation led by Fidel Castro had recently aligned itself with the Soviet Union after the Cuban Revolution. From Moscow's perspective, placing missiles there would dramatically change the strategic balance between the two superpowers. After all, the United States already had nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy right on the Soviet Union's doorstep. Cuba would be the Soviet answer. And if the plan worked, Soviet nuclear missiles would sit just 90 miles from the coast of Florida, close enough to strike major American cities within minutes. For months, the operation remains hidden from the world. But in October, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft flying high above Cuba photographed something alarming: missile launch sites under construction in the Cuban countryside. When the images reached Washington, President John F. Kennedy and his advisors realized the implications immediately. The Soviet Union isn't just supporting Cuba politically, It's turning the island into a nuclear missile base. On October 22nd, Kennedy goes on national television and announces that the United States will establish a naval blockade around Cuba. No more Soviet military shipments will be allowed to reach the island. American warships will intercept and inspect vessels approaching Cuban waters. And as you can imagine, the announcement shocks the world. And for the next 13 days, the United States and the Soviet Union stare each other down across the edge of nuclear war. Military forces on both sides go to the highest levels of readiness. Strategic bombers are placed on alert. Nuclear missiles are prepared for launch. Historians would later describe the Cuban Missile Crisis as the closest the human race has ever come to nuclear annihilation. But even in the middle of that global standoff, there were pieces of the puzzle that neither side fully understood. The Americans knew about the missiles in Cuba. What they didn't know was that the Soviet Navy had also dispatched a small group of submarines towards the Caribbean, and those submarines carried weapons that would make the situation far more dangerous than anyone in Washington realized. While the world focused on missile sites and diplomatic ultimatums, another part of the Soviet plan was already moving stealthily across the Atlantic Ocean. The entire operation had been given a code name by the Soviet military, Operation Anadyr. Now, the name itself was a piece of misdirection. Anadyr is a remote region in far eastern Siberia, thousands of miles from Cuba. Soviet planners deliberately chose the name to make it sound like the deployment had something to do with the Arctic rather than the Caribbean. Secrecy was essential. Khrushchev's government wanted to move troops, missiles, and military equipment into Cuba without provoking the United States into immediate action. Cargo ships carried missile launchers, nuclear warheads, and thousands of Soviet personnel across the Atlantic. But alongside those cargo ships, another force was sent to protect the mission: 4 Soviet submarines. Each of them was a diesel-electric Foxtrot-class submarine, the backbone of the Soviet Navy's submarine fleet at the time. These boats were designed primarily for operations in the cold waters of the North Atlantic and Arctic, not the sweltering tropical seas around Cuba. Still, the orders were clear. The submarines would travel across the Atlantic, slip past American naval patrols, and take up positions near Cuba. If the United States attempted to invade the island, these submarines would be there to defend Soviet shipping and Soviet forces. But the most dangerous part of their mission was something the Americans didn't know. Each of the submarines carried a special weapon, a T-5 nuclear torpedo. The warhead on that torpedo had a yield of roughly 10 to 15 kilotons, comparable to the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima in 1945. Detonated underwater, the explosion could devastate an entire formation of warships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, everything within miles. The presence of those nuclear weapons was a closely guarded secret, even within the Soviet military. And the United States Navy, searching the waters around Cuba, had absolutely no idea those weapons existed. From the American perspective, the mission was simple: enforce the blockade, track Soviet submarines, and force them to surface if they approached the quarantine line. But down beneath the ocean surface, those submarines were carrying weapons capable of triggering the very war both sides were trying to avoid. And one of those submarines was B-59. And within days, it would find itself surrounded by American warships. Among the officers aboard submarine B-59 in October 1962 was a man whose authority on the boat was somewhat unusual. He wasn't the captain. That position belonged to Captain Valentin Savitsky. But sitting in the control room that day was another officer whose opinion carried enormous weight, and his name was Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov. Arkhipov had been born in 1926 in a small rural village outside of Moscow. His parents were peasants, part of a generation that had lived through revolution, famine, and the brutal upheavals of early Soviet history. Like many young men of his generation, Arkhipov's life was shaped by war. He came of age during the final years of World War II and joined the Soviet Navy not long afterwards, at a time when the Soviet Union was pouring enormous resources into building a modern submarine fleet. By the late 1950s, Arkhipov had built a reputation as a steady and capable officer. Not flashy, not loud, but the kind of man other sailors trusted when things got difficult. That reputation would be tested in a dramatic way the year before the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1961, Arkhipov was serving as the executive officer aboard the Soviet nuclear submarine K-19. You may have heard of it. They made a movie about it and everything. K-19 was one of the Soviet Union's first nuclear-powered submarines, a cutting-edge piece of technology meant to compete with the growing fleet of American nuclear subs. But like many early nuclear vessels, it suffered from serious design and safety problems. In July of that year, while operating in the North Atlantic, disaster struck. The submarine's nuclear reactor cooling system failed. Without coolant, the reactor temperature began climbing rapidly. If the reactor melted down, it could release massive radiation into the ocean and potentially trigger a catastrophic explosion inside the submarine. The crew of K-19 had almost no equipment to deal with the crisis. In desperation, several sailors volunteered to enter the reactor compartment and improvise repairs using crude tools and makeshift protective gear. The radiation levels inside the compartment were lethal. The men who entered knew they were sacrificing themselves, and many of them did. Within weeks, several crew members died from acute radiation poisoning, but the reactor was stabilized and the submarine managed to limp back to port. Arkhipov, serving as the second in command, helped organize the crew during the emergency and kept the situation from collapsing into panic. Those who served with him remembered his calm demeanor during the crisis. He had already faced the possibility of a nuclear disaster once, and he hadn't panicked, so he's a pretty good guy to have on board. By October of 1962, Arkhipov had been promoted to captain second rank, roughly the equivalent to a commander in the U.S. Navy. More importantly, he had been given responsibility for the small flotilla of submarines being sent towards Cuba. That meant that although Savitsky commanded B-59 itself, Arkhipov held senior authority over the mission. His presence aboard the submarine wasn't accidental. He was there to oversee the operation, and if a critical decision had to be made, his voice would carry enormous weight. Which meant that when the crisis aboard 59 finally reached its breaking point, the fate of the submarine, and possibly much more than that, would rest in the judgment of a man who had already once stared down a nuclear catastrophe and lived to tell the tale. Now, submarine B-59 was a Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarine, one of the most common designs in the Soviet fleet during the early Cold War. It was a capable war machine, but it had been designed with a very particular environment in mind, and that was the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Inside the submarine, nearly 80 sailors lived and worked in a space barely larger than a small house. Pipes, valves, and electrical wiring covered almost every surface. Bunks were stacked tightly together in narrow compartments, and many sailors had to sleep in shifts, climbing into beds that had only just been vacated by another exhausted crewmate. Under normal living circumstances, life aboard a submarine was uncomfortable, but Soviet submarines were often rougher environments than their American counterparts. Part of the difference came down to technology. By the early 1960s, the United States Navy had already begun deploying large numbers of nuclear-powered submarines, vessels that could remain underwater for months at a time without needing to surface. Those boats had more electrical power available for ventilation systems, cooling equipment, and atmospheric controls. The Soviet Navy, by contrast, still relied heavily on diesel-electric submarines like the Foxtrot class. These boats ran quietly on battery power while submerged, but those batteries eventually had to be recharged by running diesel engines, which required the submarine to surface or snorkel. In a tense military standoff, surfacing could mean being spotted by enemy ships or aircraft. So submarines like B-59 often stayed underwater as long as possible. The longer they remained submerged, the more difficult life inside the boat became. And there was another difference between the two navies that mattered as well. American submarines were designed with the expectation that crews might remain at sea for long patrols, sometimes lasting months. Keeping sailors healthy and functional for that long meant paying attention to air quality, temperature control, and crew comfort. Soviet submarines were built with a different philosophy: mission first, endurance second, and comfort was somewhere a little farther down the list. Under normal conditions, the differences might not have mattered much. Submarines are uncomfortable places no matter which navy you serve in, but the waters around Cuba are anything but normal. When B-59 entered the Caribbean, the temperature inside the submarine began to climb. And climb, and climb. The ventilation system struggled to cope with the tropical heat outside the hull and the heat generated by the engines, batteries, and electrical equipment inside. So within days, the temperature inside the submarine reportedly rose well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sailors stripped down to their undies to stay cool. Sweat dripped from the ceiling pipes. Metal surfaces even became hot to the touch. But most dangerous change wasn't the heat. It was the air. With the submarine sealed beneath the ocean surface, the crew was breathing the same shitty atmosphere over and over again. And as the hours passed, carbon dioxide levels inside the boat slowly increased. At first, the symptoms were subtle: headaches, fatigue, short tempers. But as carbon dioxide levels rose higher, the effects became more serious. High concentrations of CO2 can impair clear thinking. They slow reaction times, cloud judgment, and make people more irritable and prone to emotional outbursts. In extreme cases, they can cause confusion and panic. In other words, the officers aboard B-59 were being forced to make life and death decisions while their bodies were under severe physiological stress. Everyone aboard the submarine was exhausted. Everyone was overheated, and everyone knew that somewhere above them, American warships were searching the ocean. The atmosphere inside the submarine was already tense, and it was about to become explosive. By late October 1962, the waters around Cuba had become one of the most heavily patrolled stretches of ocean on Earth. American destroyers, aircraft, and patrol ships were sweeping the region day and night, enforcing the naval blockade President Kennedy had announced to the world. Their mission was straightforward: prevent additional Soviet military shipments from reaching Cuba. But there was another concern. American commanders knew Soviet submarines might already be in the area, and they were determined to find them. Submarine B-59 had crossed most of the Atlantic undetected. But once it entered the Caribbean, the environment began to work against it. Warmer water made sonar more effective, and the net tightened. Eventually, U.S. Navy destroyers picked up a contact. Something was moving beneath the surface, and they began to close in. From the American perspective, what happened next was controlled, measured, and even cautious. The Navy had a procedure for dealing with unidentified submarines during the blockade. The goal was not to destroy them, that risked escalation, but to force them to surface and identify themselves. So they used what were called practice depth charges. These were small, controlled explosives, not designed to damage a submarine, but to send a signal. We know you're down there. Surface immediately. It was, in theory, a form of communication. But communication only works if both sides understand the language, and in this case, they didn't. The Soviet crews aboard these submarines had never been clearly briefed on this American signaling method. There had been no shared protocol, no coordinated understanding, no moment where both sides agreed, hey, this is what this means. So when the charges detonated around B-59, the crew didn't hear a warning. They heard explosives, loud, repetitive, and closing in. Inside the submarine, there was no context to interpret them as anything else. And the deeper problem was this: there was no way to ask. No radio contact with Moscow. No communication with the American ships above. No confirmation of intent. Just sound, just pressure, and just the growing certainty that something had gone very, very wrong. From the American perspective, they were signaling. From the Soviet perspective, they were under attack. And neither side realized how close they were to crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Inside B-59, the situation was being interpreted in a different way. The explosions outside the hull weren't seen as signals, they were the opening moves of a war. And in that moment, the structure of the Soviet command became critical. On most Soviet submarines, a decision like this would have rested with two men, the captain and the political officer. Both had to agree. And on B-59, both of them already had. Captain Valentin Savitsky believed the situation was clear. If war had begun, then B-59 had a duty to respond. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed. Two men had already decided, but B-59 carried something unusual. The third authority was on board, Vasily Arkhipov, the commander of the entire submarine flotilla, and a man who outranked the captain himself, which meant that on this submarine, the decision didn't just rest with two men, it rested with three. And that turned out to be a pretty big deal, because in a moment like this, cut off from Moscow, trapped underwater, and forced to interpret events on their own, Soviet commanders were expected to act, to decide. There was no waiting for confirmation, no second layer of verification, only judgment. Savitsky wasn't hesitating. He believed he already had his answer, and he reportedly shouted, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not become the shame of the fleet." Two men were ready to fire a nuclear weapon, and only one remained, Vasily. And unlike the others, Vasily paused. Something didn't fit. If the Americans truly intended to destroy them, why use smaller controlled explosions? Why not finish it? This didn't feel like an attack. It felt deliberate, measured, a signal. And Vasily was salty enough to realize the difference between a true attack and something else. He argued that the submarine should surface. Inside the control room, the debate stretched on, punctuated by the dull shock of explosions echoing through the hull. But without Archipov's agreement, the weapon could not be launched. Finally, Savitsky relented. The order was given, surface the submarine, and slowly, B-59 rose toward the surface. And when it finally broke through the waves, the crew saw the American ships waiting around them. The war had not begun. The explosions had been signals, and the nuclear torpedo remained unfired. And when submarine B-59 finally surfaced, the situation changed almost instantly. After days trapped beneath the ocean, the crew emerged into blinding Caribbean sunlight. American destroyers surrounded them on all sides, gray holes cutting through the water as sailors gathered along the decks to watch. For the Americans, it was a tense but controlled moment. They had done what they set out to do. They had forced a submarine to the surface. But what they didn't know was how close they had come to being destroyed. Inside B-59 sat a nuclear torpedo powerful enough to wipe out every ship in sight. And only minutes earlier, the officers aboard that submarine had been arguing about whether to use it. The Americans believed they'd been sending a signal, and the Soviets thought they were under attack. Two sides, two interpretations, and one misunderstanding that nearly changed the course of history. Eventually, B-59 turned away and began the long journey back across the Atlantic. The crisis, at least in that moment, had passed. But the return home was anything but triumphant. When the submarines reached the Soviet Union, there were no celebrations awaiting, no recognition for what had been avoided. Instead, there was criticism. The boats had been detected. One had been forced to surface. To Soviet leadership, that was failure. And according to later accounts, a senior admiral reportedly told returning crews it might have been better if they had gone down with their ships than been forced to surface. There was no discussion of the nuclear torpedo, no acknowledgement of how close the world had come to catastrophe, and certainly no recognition for the man who prevented it. Vasily Arkhipov returned to his career the same way he had lived it, quietly and professionally. He continued serving in the Soviet Navy for years, eventually rising to the rank of vice admiral. And the events aboard B-59 remained buried, known only to a small circle of officials, and they weren't talking. It wasn't until decades later, after the Cold War had ended and Soviet archives began to open, that the full story finally came into focus. And with it, the realization that everything had come down to one guy and one decision. History tends to remember the people who start wars, the generals, the presidents, the leaders whose decisions move armies and reshape borders. But sometimes the fate of the world turns on something much quieter: a single person deciding not to act. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the United States and the Soviet Union were already standing on the edge of nuclear war. Missiles were armed. Bombers were ready. Both sides were preparing for the possibility that everything could end in a matter of hours. And somewhere beneath the ocean, inside a steel submarine, cut off from the world, 3 men argued about what to do next. 2 thought that the war had started, and 1 wasn't convinced. And I'll be honest with you. Growing up in the United States, especially during the tail end of the Cold War, the story always felt simple. We were the good guys. They were the bad guys. And that's how it showed up in movies. And that's how it showed up in conversations. And that's how a lot of us learned to see the world. But history isn't clean, man. Because when you zoom in, past the flags, past the politics, past the propaganda and the bullshit, you don't find good countries and bad countries. You find people. And sometimes, the person on the other side of that divide is the one who saves your ass. Vasily Arkhipov didn't refuse to launch that torpedo because he was trying to be a hero. He wasn't making a grand statement. He was doing something simpler. He was thinking. He questioned what he was seeing, and he refused to act on incomplete information. He chose restraint in a moment that demanded reaction. And he did what he thought was right in the face of formidable opposition. And because he did, the torpedo was never fired, which is strange to think about. Now, getting back to Crimson Tide, you've now heard a real version of this movie. A hardened captain, played by Gene Hackman, convinced the order is real, and a young executive officer, played by Denzel Washington, demanding proof. And what makes the movie so good isn't just the argument. It's everything happening around it. The side conversations, the debates about history and trivia, like where the Lippinzahner stallions are from. These little flashes of normal life happening inside a steel tube that could end the world. That's what makes it feel real. Because even in moments like that, people are still people. It's tense, it's dramatic, and it makes for great storytelling. But the real version of that story didn't happen on a movie set. It happened in October in 1962, and there was no script, there was no guarantee, and there was no second take. Just a man standing in a control room surrounded by people who believed they were already at war. And he said no. History is full of moments like that. Moments where everything could have gone one way or the other. Sometimes those moments belong to names we all recognize. And sometimes they belong to someone we've never even heard of. A quiet Soviet naval officer, whose decision made deep beneath the Caribbean Sea may have helped prevent a nuclear war. Vasily Arkhipov is today's voice of the past, and his credit is long overdue. Thanks for joining me for this episode. This story kind of spoke to me today, and here's why. There's a lot of shitty things going on in the world right now. And if there's a guy out there like Vasily, I sure hope he shows up when we need him to. Thanks for listening. Well, that'll about do it for this episode of The People We Meet. But before we go, I just want to say thank you. Seriously, this show only exists because you keep showing up, listening, sharing, and being a part of it. And I don't take that lightly. And to my family for humoring my foolish endeavors. And if something in this episode stuck with you, pass it along. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you've got a story, your story or someone else's that deserves a voice, I want to hear from you. Head over to the People We Meet podcast and reach out. You can also find the show on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Podbean. Give it a follow. Stay connected and help this thing grow. Thanks again for listening. And as always, be good to each other.